The oldest temple ever discovered on Earth wasn't destroyed by war, fire, or the slow grinding of time. It was buried, deliberately, carefully, by the very people who built it. And they made sure no one would see it again for a very long time. Think about that for a second. Not abandoned, not collapsed, filled in, stone by stone, layer by layer, with thousands of tons of rubble, gravel, and broken animal bone, until a temple complex larger than a football field simply disappeared under a hill in southeastern Turkey. And here's the detail that should bother you. The people who did this lived roughly 11,600 years ago. That is something like 6,500 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza was built. Before pottery existed anywhere on Earth. Before the wheel. Before anyone, anywhere, is supposed to have planted a single deliberate row of wheat. And yet they organized enough labor, enough food, and enough shared belief to quarry, carve, raise, and then intentionally bury a monument that size. There's one stone inside that buried temple you need to know about. It's called Pillar 43. People who study it informally call it the vulture stone. It has a vulture carved into it, a scorpion, a headless man, and depending on who you ask, it might be the oldest written warning in human history. We'll come back to that pillar. We are not there yet. This place is called Göbekli Tepe. The name means potbelly hill in Turkish, and it sits on a limestone ridge in the Şanlıurfa province of southeastern Turkey, close to the modern border with Syria. A German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt began digging there in 1995, and what he found didn't just add a new entry to the textbooks. It broke the textbooks. Here's what they don't tell you in the museum exhibit. For decades, the entire model of how human civilization began rested on one assumption. Farming came first. Once people settled down to grow food, they had surplus, they had free time. And only then, almost as a luxury, did they invent religion, temples, and organized belief. Göbekli Tepe took that model and flipped it. The people who built it were hunter-gatherers. No agriculture, no permanent farms, no domesticated herd animals. And they still raised T-shaped limestone pillars weighing up to 10 tons, arranged in circles, carved with foxes, boars, snakes, and birds' prey thousands of years before. By the old model, they were supposed to be capable of any of it. So ask yourself the obvious question. If a society with no farms, no metal tools, and no wheels could organize a project on that scale, what exactly were they protecting or preparing for? That made burying the whole thing afterward worth the effort. That's not a small detail. That is the entire mystery. And there are three very different answers circulating right now. One is the story most documentaries still tell you. One is what the archaeologists currently working the site are quietly revising. And one is a theory most universities will not put their name on. We are going to walk through all three. By the end, you can decide which one keeps you up at night. Let's start with the story you've probably already heard, because for almost 2 decades, this was the only story anyone told. When Klaus Schmidt published his early findings, he didn't hedge. He believed he had found something that rewrote the order of human development itself. His own description, repeated in countless documentaries since, was direct. He called Göbekli Tepe the first human-built holy place on Earth. Not a settlement, not a home. A temple raised before towns, before farms, before anything resembling ordinary domestic life. In this version of events, religion didn't follow civilization. Religion built it. The need to gather, to worship, to carve meaning into stone, pulled scattered hunter-gatherer bands together from miles around, year after year, until the gathering place itself slowly became permanent. Farming, in this telling, wasn't the cause of organized society. It was the consequence of needing to feed everyone who kept showing up for the ceremony. It's a clean story. It's a powerful story. It's the version that made Göbekli Tepe famous, printed across National Geographic spreads, and turned a quiet hill in rural Turkey into one of the most visited archaeological sites in the country. But here's the problem with that explanation. If Göbekli Tepe really was a pure temple, a sacred site deliberately set apart from daily life, you would expect almost nothing domestic around it. No cooking, no food storage, no evidence that ordinary people were actually living anywhere nearby in serious numbers. That is not what later excavation seasons found. In the years after Schmidt's death in 2014, archaeologists working the site uncovered grinding stones, large quantities of butchered wild game bone, gazelle, wild boar aurochs, and storage features clustered close to the carved enclosures. Whoever built this place wasn't visiting briefly and walking home. People were eating here, cooking here, quite possibly living here, at least seasonally, in numbers large enough to require serious food preparation on a regular basis. So the clean version, pure temple, no town, religion inventing civilization out of nowhere, doesn't hold up the way it once did. And once you start pulling at that thread, the official narrative starts to fray in other places too. This is where the documentary version of the story usually stops talking. And this is where the official record goes quiet. Here's the version most documentaries skip over, because it's less dramatic, but it's the one currently being argued inside actual excavation reports. A researcher named Lee Clare, who has coordinated ongoing fieldwork at Göbekli Tepe through the German Archaeological Institute, has spent years pushing back on the simple "world's first" temple headline. According to the picture now emerging from his team's work, Göbekli Tepe wasn't an isolated miracle, was one node in a much larger network of related sites across the same region, now grouped under a project name you may not have heard: Taş Tepeler, the Stone Hills, Karahan Tepe, Saber, several others, all roughly contemporary, all sharing the same carving style, the same T-shaped pillars, the same animal symbolism. That single fact changes the question entirely. This wasn't one isolated group of geniuses building one impossible monument in total isolation. This was a shared culture, spread across region, expressing the same ideas in stone at multiple locations, over what appears to be a span of centuries. And the burying. In this academic reading, deliberate backfilling wasn't a single dramatic, mysterious act performed once in secret. It looks more like a recurring ritual practice. Enclosures at Göbekli Tepe appear to have been built, used for a period, then deliberately closed and filled in, sometimes followed by the construction of a new enclosure nearby. Some researchers compare this to a kind of ceremonial decommissioning, not concealment in the dramatic sense. Closure. The same way some cultures retire a building through ritual rather than simply letting it collapse. There's also a less mystical, more human explanation for the scale of the labor involved. Evidence from animal bone deposits, large quantities of wild game consumed in concentrated episodes, points towards something close to competitive feasting. Groups gathering periodically, slaughtering large numbers of animals, and using that shared excess to build social bonds, status, and obligation between bands that otherwise had no reason to cooperate. Build, gather, feast, bury, repeat. Not a singular forbidden secret. A recurring social technology for holding together a society that had no chiefs, no writing, and no government to enforce cooperation any other way. This is the academic position now, and it's frustrating in a very particular way, because it's almost certainly more accurate than the dramatic version, and far less satisfying. It explains the scale. It explains the burial. It does not explain Pillar 43. But before we get to the pillar, there's something else the academic record is quietly wrestling with. And it has nothing to do with astronomy or catastrophe theory. It has to do with the bones. In the years since Schmidt's death, a forensic analysis of the animal remains at Göbekli Tepe has produced a number that doesn't fit the simple feasting model as cleanly as the textbooks would like. Researchers estimate that the quantity of butchered gazelle alone, based on preserved bone density across the excavated enclosures, suggests that during active use periods, the site may have hosted gatherings of several hundred people at a time, possibly more. Several hundred people. 11,600 years ago. Hunter-gatherers. People who, by every prior assumption we had about the Paleolithic, were supposed to be living in bands of 20 to 50 individuals, moving with the seasons, incapable of sustained logistical coordination across distances. Where did they come from? How did they know when to arrive? How did word travel across the limestone ridges of southeastern Anatolia before writing, before permanent messengers, before any infrastructure we recognize as infrastructure? These are questions the feasting model raises without fully answering. You can say competitive feasting created social bonds. You cannot easily explain how the logistics of feeding several hundred people in one location were organized and repeated, season after season, across a span of centuries, by people who, on paper, had no mechanism for doing so. Joris Peters, a zooarchaeologist at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, has spent years on the bone assemblages from Göbekli Tepe and the surrounding Taş Tepeler sites. His published work is careful and technical, the language of journal articles, not documentaries. But buried inside that language is a conclusion that should bother you more than it probably does. The scale of organized hunting at these sites was not incidental. It required planning across multiple bands, over extended periods, in ways that point toward a degree of social complexity we have not typically assigned to pre-agricultural societies in this era. Social complexity without agriculture, without permanent settlement as far as anyone can currently determine, without a chief or a king or a written law or a storehouse of grain to enforce compliance. And yet, somehow, the coordination happened, repeatedly, at multiple sites, across centuries. Lee Clare's team has also been working on something that rarely makes the documentary circuit: the question of what, exactly, was carved on the pillars, and why the carving style changed over time. The earliest enclosures, the deepest layers, the oldest structures, show T-shaped pillars with animal carvings of the highest technical precision. Later enclosures, built after some of the earlier ones had already been deliberately filled in, show cruder work, smaller pillars, less elaborate carvings, as if the builders were either in a hurry or had lost access to whatever knowledge or resources had made the early work possible, or both. That decline in craft quality is not a detail you will find in most popular accounts of Göbekli Tepe. It doesn't fit the narrative of a civilization on the rise. It fits something else, a tradition being maintained after the people who fully understood it were gone. A form preserved without the content that originally animated it. Think about what that means carefully. The people who built the later enclosures were still building, still carving, still burying, but the thing they were doing it for, the knowledge, the original impulse, the reason, may have already been lost by the time those later stones went into the ground. That is the academic position when you read between the lines, not a mystery solved, a mystery that keeps getting stranger the more carefully you excavate it. There is one more thing the current academic literature can't cleanly explain, and it is so obvious that most sources simply don't mention it. Göbekli Tepe sits on top of a hill, not in a valley, not near a river, not adjacent to any water source that would make large-scale habitation practical. The nearest permanent water was at least several kilometers away, depending on the season. Carrying water to feed several hundred people across that distance, across that terrain, was not a trivial undertaking. The people who chose that hilltop location were not making a practical choice. They were making a deliberate one. Something about that specific ridge, at that specific elevation, with those specific sightlines in every direction, mattered enough to accept the logistical burden of building there instead of somewhere easier. The academic record notes this. It does not explain it. And that gap is where the third perspective walks in. Now we go back to the stone we promised you at the very beginning. Pillar 43 sits inside what's called Enclosure D, one of the oldest and most elaborately carved structures on the site. Carved into it, a vulture, wings spread, holding what appears to be a sphere. Above one outstretched limb, a headless man below it, a scorpion, several birds, and along the top edge, a row of small symbols that look less like decoration and more like a sequence. In 2017, a researcher named Martin Sweatman, an engineering professor at the University of Edinburgh, published a paper in the journal Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry, making a claim that the mainstream archaeological community has never fully accepted and has never fully been able to dismiss either. Sweatman proposed that the animal symbols on Pillar 43 are not random totems. He argued they function as astronomical markers, representing constellations, and that read together, they encode a specific date. The date his analysis points toward sits close to 10,950 years before the Common Era. That is within range of an event known to climate scientists as the Younger Dryas, a sudden, severe cooling period that struck the northern hemisphere with almost no warning, disrupting ecosystems across the planet. A growing minority of researchers, separate from, and often in open conflict with, mainstream archaeology, argue this cooling event was triggered or worsened by a fragmented comet impact. If Sweatman's reading holds, Pillar 43 isn't art. It's a record, possibly even a warning, carved by people who had survived something catastrophic and wanted whoever came after them to remember exactly when it happened. This is the theory most universities will not put their name on. Author Graham Hancock popularized it for a mass audience in his book Magicians of the Gods, arguing that Göbekli Tepe wasn't humanity's first temple at all. It was a memorial, built by the survivors of an advanced pre-agricultural society that had been nearly wiped out, who carved their warning into stone because they no longer trusted memory, speech, or each other to carry it forward. And suddenly the burial looks different. Not closure, not ritual decommissioning, protection. If you believed your monument encoded something that mattered, coordinates, a date, a memory worth preserving past your own lifetime, burying it under stone and dirt is exactly what you would do to keep it from weather, war, or anyone who might misuse it before they were ready to understand it. Here's the detail that makes this harder to dismiss than it should be. This is not a story about a fringe website. This is not a story about a discredited crank with no credentials. This is not even a story confined to alternative history forums. This is a story about a peer-reviewed engineering professor, publishing in an actual academic journal, making a claim that the rest of his field has spent 8 years arguing about, without ever fully closing the case. Here is what Sweatman's analysis actually involves, because most popular accounts either oversimplify it or dismisses it without engaging the specifics. Pillar 43 carries a set of animal figures arranged in distinct zones. Sweatman treated each animal as a potential representation of a constellation, mapping them against the known star patterns of the Fertile Crescent sky in different historical epochs, working backward from the present using precession calculations. Precession is the slow wobble of Earth's axis, which causes the position of the stars relative to any given calendar date to shift over thousands of years at a predictable, calculable rate. If you know which constellation was at a specific position in the sky on a specific date, and if you can match an ancient carving to that constellation, you can in principle read the carving as a date stamp. Sweatman's match: the vulture aligned with Sagittarius, the scorpion aligned with Scorpius. The position of the sun on the summer solstice points toward the period around 10,900 BCE. That date, again, sits within the window of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. The coincidence is either meaningless or it isn't, and the only honest answer is that nobody has been able to prove which. What has generated the most sustained academic discomfort isn't actually the date. It's the implication behind it. If the carvings on Pillar 43 are intentional astronomical notation, if the people who made them understood precession, understood the movements of specific constellations across specific seasons, and were deliberately encoding that understanding into stone, then we are looking at a level of astronomical knowledge that, by the established timeline of human cognitive development, should not exist at this date. Formal astronomy, in the conventional account, emerges with settled civilization, with cities, scribes, observatories built by kings with the resources to fund them. The Babylonians, the Egyptians, the later megalithic cultures of Europe. Pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers are not supposed to have looked at the sky with that kind of systematic, multi-generational precision. But multi-generational precision is exactly what precession-based observation requires. The shift is slow, roughly 1 degree every 72 years. To notice it, track it, and encode it meaningfully, You need consistent observation across multiple human lifetimes, passed down accurately enough to be usable generations later. That requires either writing, which didn't exist, or an oral tradition of extraordinary discipline and fidelity maintained across centuries by people with no fixed home. Some researchers in the alternative history community, following Hancock's framework, argue that this is precisely the point. That there existed, before the Younger Dryas, a culture sophisticated enough to have built that observational tradition over centuries or millennia, and that Göbekli Tepe is what their survivors left behind when the world they knew was gone. Not the peak of what that culture achieved. The ruins of it, the attempt to preserve the most critical knowledge, the date, the warning, the memory of the catastrophe, in the only medium that might survive. Stone, buried, on top of a hill where the sightlines to the sky were unobstructed in every direction. This is the reading that makes the hilltop location suddenly make sense. Not practical. Intentional. A monument designed to be found, eventually, by people who knew how to read what was written on it. Here is the problem with dismissing this reading outright. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. The idea that the cooling period around 10,900 BCE was caused or worsened by a fragmented comet striking or air bursting over the northern hemisphere is not a fringe idea in the way it was 10 years ago. A team of researchers publishing in peer-reviewed journals, including a 2018 paper in Scientific Reports, have identified a layer of platinum, microspherules, and nanodiamonds at multiple sites across the northern hemisphere, all dating to roughly the same geological horizon. These are markers consistent with extraterrestrial impact. They are not proof, they are evidence. And they are the kind of evidence that, in any other field, would generate sustained, well-funded investigation rather than the uncomfortable silence they have largely produced in mainstream archaeology. Why the silence? That is a question worth sitting with. The evidence isn't secret. The papers are published, peer-reviewed, and publicly available. The researchers are credentialed. The case for a major cosmic event near the beginning of the Holocene is not constructed from nothing. And yet the field that would be most affected by taking it seriously, archaeology, with its established timeline of human development, has been notably slow to engage it directly. One answer is the one that academics always give, and it's not entirely wrong. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and what we have is suggestive but not definitive. Another answer, the one that tends to appear in comment sections rather than academic papers, is that the implications are too disruptive. If there was a sophisticated pre-agricultural civilization capable of astronomical observation, large-scale coordination, and multi-generational knowledge transmission, and if that civilization was largely destroyed by a cosmic impact around 10,900 BCE, then almost everything we think we know about the emergence of human complexity needs to be reconsidered. Not adjusted. Reconsidered from the foundation. That's not a comfortable place for a field to go. It requires admitting that the silence in the record, the apparent leap from small bands of hunter-gatherers to agricultural civilizations to cities, might not be a gradual development we haven't fully mapped yet. It might be a gap, a discontinuity, the before and after of an event that erased most of what came before it, leaving only the stones that someone, for reasons we still cannot fully explain, chose to bury carefully under a hill in southeastern Turkey before walking away. The headless man on Pillar 43 has never been explained, not by the traditional view, not by the academic consensus, not by the alternative history camp. A headless human figure, surrounded by birds and a scorpion, carved into the oldest deliberately buried monument in human history. It appears exactly once. It has no parallel at any other site in the Taş Tepeler network. No one has published a satisfying account of what it means. Maybe it means nothing. Maybe it was a local motif, a specific myth, a story that the carvers community understood and we have simply lost the context for. That is the safest answer, and it may well be the correct one. But it is also the answer that closes the question before it has been fully asked. And there is something worth noting about a figure without a head, carved by people who may have been trying to record the memory of a world that was cut short. Carved into stone, buried, protected, left for someone who would come later and understand what it was pointing at. Whether we are those people, whether we have finally developed the tools to read what was left for us, is not a question the stones answer. It's a question they ask. So where does that leave you? 3 explanations, 3 groups of serious people, each looking at the exact same buried hill and walking away with a completely different idea of what happened there. The popularized version says religion built civilization, and Göbekli Tepe is proof. The current academic version says it's part of a wider culture across the Taş Tepeler region, closed through recurring ritual practice and competitive feasting rather than any single secret. The fringe version says the carvings encode the date of a global catastrophe, and the burial was an act of preservation by people trying to protect a memory they were terrified the rest of the world would lose. None of these 3 groups have access to information the others don't. They're looking at the same pillars, the same stratigraphy, the same vulture, the same scorpion, the same headless man. And after almost 30 years of digging, they still cannot agree on why a society with no writing, no metal tools, and no permanent farms decided that the most important thing to do with their greatest achievement was put it in the ground and walk away. Maybe it really was just ritual closure, repeated so many times across so many enclosures that it became custom rather than mystery. Or maybe a small group of people 11,000 years ago understood something about the sky, the climate, or their own survival that we are only now starting to take seriously again. The stones themselves don't tell you which. They were never given the chance to. Someone made sure of that, on purpose, a very long time ago. So here's the question I'll leave you with. If Pillar 43 really does encode the date of a global catastrophe, and the people who buried it were trying to protect that memory rather than hide a secret, does that change how you feel about the 11,000 years of history we think we already understand? Or do you think the simpler answer, feasting, ritual, closure, nothing more, is the one we should be defending, precisely because it doesn't ask us to rewrite everything else we think we know? Let me know where you land. I suspect we won't agree. We have only just touched a part of this mystery, but the real question lies in your perspective. What do you think really happened at Göbekli Tepe? Was it ritual closure, repeated until it became custom, or was it a warning, buried on purpose by people who were terrified we'd forget it? Is there anything we missed? Leave your thoughts in the comment section below. I am always here to discuss and listen to your deeper insights.